So I principally mean to talk about the Epistemology and the New Way of Words essay today. And one of the handouts that you've got is passages from that. It's a tough essay to get on top of, to understand what he wants to do, what he actually does in it, and why he thinks what he does is responsive to his motivations. So anyway, this is a bit of boiling down for it. Sellars was acutely aware in these early years of being in the early phase of a new movement in philosophy that, at least in retrospect, we can see as analytic philosophy. Before he had actually published any of his own writings, but he desperately needed to put some publications out there so as not to lose his job, put out a volume of essays, Readings in Philosophical Analysis in 1949, that became, if not a Bible for early American analytic philosophy, at any rate, the text that everyone read from, the book of essays, collected essays, starting with On Denoting, that were to define this area. He and his buddy Feigl at the University of Minnesota in 1950 started the journal Phil Studies, meaning it to be the major journal of this new movement, thinking of the journals that were already in existence, the Journal of Philosophy at Columbia, the Phil Review at Cornell, as being more general purpose, as not being devoted to this new movement of analytic philosophy. And Sellars was concerned to shape this movement in the direction that he thought was progressive. If you look at the opening passages in this quote, these are from the first two paragraphs. The general perspective of the present paper can best be indicated by saying that the author is a rationalistic realist who has deserted to the camp of logical empiricism, which he identifies with the New Way of Words from the title. This change of allegiance has been made possible by the development of the semantic phase of the pure theory of languages. For only with the achievements of pure semantics did the formal linguistic approach to epistemological and metaphysical issues begin to appear relevant, let alone adequate. So he's announcing this shift in his own look from being a rationalist and a realist to being a logical empiricist, and he's associating that shift with developments in what he's describing as the pure theory of languages. In the next paragraph, he goes on to say, today it's generally recognized that the tools of the syntactical phase of logical empiricism were not up to the task of dealing with all genuinely philosophical issues, that the situation has been improved by the addition of the semantic dimension to the pure theory of languages is clear. Now, philosophy is properly conceived as the pure theory of empirically meaningful languages, and pure semantics as it now exists is but a fragment of such a theory. So he's got at least two historical strands of thought that he's appealing to in placing himself in space here. On the one hand, rationalism and empiricism. Well, there's that mention of realism as well. And then he's talking about the phases of what turned out to be Carnap, the Vienna Circle. He's describing this as the pure theory of languages. Carnap's syntactical phase, his semantical phase, and as we'll see, Sellars is, in this essay, hoping to turn the crank a third time and move to a pragmatic phase. Pure pragmatics is supposed to subsume the syntax and the semantics. Principal text we'll read for next week that he was working on at the same time as this, and Realism and the New Way of Words, is pure pragmatics and epistemology. Pure pragmatics being the term that he picked for where he thought this new movement should go. So I want to talk about how he was conceiving of this philosophically, but I mentioned last time that throughout his life, Sellars was an outlier within analytic philosophy, in the first place in having these deep historical interests, that everything he thought about as the next phase of some development of historical modes of thought. Hegel said, philosophy cannot but be one's time captured in thought. And no one lived that insight more than Sellars did. You can't understand what he's thinking about unless you see how he sees it as fitting into the historical developments. The other dimension on which he's an outlier is being a systematic philosopher, not seeing the unit of philosophical thought as the short, self-contained, gem-like essay, but rather aiming for a synoptic vision, as he put it. That's one of the reasons it was so difficult for him to write self-contained essays. They were always from fragments of some larger vision. But I want to start off by sketching some of the historical currents that he's very much aware of navigating and meaning to master and synthesize into a step forward. And there's really three of them that I'd like to talk about. One of them only very briefly. And these are the contribution of England and English philosophical thought, and then the contribution of prior American philosophical thought, and finally the contribution that he's invoking most explicitly here of German and Austrian philosophical thought. So in England, obviously he's looking to the dominant philosopher of the previous generation, Bertrand Russell, Russell and Moore, who in retrospect can be seen as championing, promoting, and producing the ideological manifesto of what was to become analytic philosophy. They were recoiling from the philosophical situation in England as they came of philosophical age, which was dominated by absolute idealism, British idealism, in the person largely of F.H. Bradley. And both Russell and Moore started off as committed Bradleyan, Hegelian British idealists and recoiled from that. And their interest, particularly Russell on the side of logic, but both of them in a distinctive movement of thought that would become analytic philosophy, were a recoil from concern with German idealism in its British interpretation. Now, that movement, in turn, Bradley had been greatly influenced and enlightened by the earlier figure T.H. Green. Bradley was born in 1846, T.H. Green in 1836. Green was responding to the dominant British empiricism, and I was just going to say, and never wrote an actual book himself. I'm not sure that that's true. He may have written one on ethics. But what Green is mostly known for is the introductions to his editions of Locke and Hume. And in those introductions, inspired by German idealism, he mounted savage critiques of classical British empiricism that are still eminently worth reading today. They, I think, rise to the level of Hegel's chapter on sense certainty in the phenomenology that they owe a lot to, and to Sellars' empiricism and philosophy of mind as criticisms of what we might call sensationalistic empiricism. At any rate, Green was reacting negatively, recoiling from a dominant empiricism on behalf of Hegel and Kant understood through a Hegelian lens. Bradley, who was a very interesting philosopher in his own right, while claiming merely to be bringing Hegel to the English language, in fact was an original philosopher with his own views, inspired by what he made of particularly Hegel's science of logic, but it's anything but orthodox Hegelianism. It was then that British idealism that Russell and Moore reacted against, and that's one that reaction that particularly the Russellian version of it we see in our essay for today. A number of Russellian expressions. The invocation of acquaintance is directly out of the problems of philosophy. He talks about logically proper names in this essay, which is a Russellian doctrine from the same place. We know he was an admirer of. We know that Sellars was an admirer of on denoting. I say that's what he gives its now canonical place as a founding document of analytic philosophy in his book of essays. So this was one strand of thought that he very much had in mind. There was also the Native American philosophical scene, which he was particularly alive to because of the position of his father in it. The situation at the turn of the century, around 1900, in the States, was one that appeared from the ground to be completely dominated by German idealism. In America, there had been some influence of Thomas Reid and Scottish common sense philosophy. Alexander McCosh at Princeton was one of the avatars of that. But the St. Louis Hegelians, starting in the 1860s, William Torrey Harris is the main figure, but Henry Conrad Brockmeyer and others as well had founded the Journal of Speculative Philosophy that flourished from 1867 to 1893. At Harvard, the center of American philosophical thought during all of this period, Josiah Royce was the grand Hegelian. He was a much more popular speaker than his best friend William James was. Both of them aspired to be more than professional philosophers, be public philosophers, and by and large, Royce succeeded better than James did at that. Royce, who was born in Berkeley, California, way back, and was recognized by the 49ers who had gone there as just brilliant, and was sent back east, well, eventually to Heidelberg to get an education. Only late in life did he ever come farther west than Cambridge, Massachusetts. He sort of didn't want to make that trek back, but did when he inherited his parents' orchard, and he's buried in Berkeley. You can go visit his grave. It says in German, "Hier liegt Josiah Royce, Obsthandler und Damenphilosoph," fruit merchant and philosopher for women, which was his arch way of talking about how the people culturally charged with sort of the high culture in America, namely women, were particularly enthusiastic about his lectures, and the hard time that he got at Harvard for giving public lectures to these large groups. But if you were coming of age philosophically in the United States in 1900, what you saw was the triumph of German idealism. And there were two movements, really, that responded to that, again recoiling, saying, no, there's a better way, there's a different way to do this. And one of them was American pragmatism. As I say, James was Josiah Royce's best friend, and James saw pragmatism as opening a second front, a new way of thinking in the Harvard philosophy department, and it was critically important to the next generation of Harvard-trained people, the most prominent of whom was C.I. Lewis, who wrote his thesis with James and Royce, and had as his life's task something like synthesizing the views of American pragmatism and German idealism in Royce's idiosyncratic version, which owed something to Bradley, but again, Royce was an interesting and original philosopher on his own. But there was another movement that recoiled from the dominant interest in German idealism around the turn of the century. And this movement, though very important, it was dominant in American academic philosophical circles in the teens and the 20s of the 20th century. And indeed, Sellars, in a passage I didn't pull out into the handout, but in this essay, mentions the realism of the teens and 20s. That's all he says about it. But on the other handout, you'll see a description of the two phases of this realism. The New Realism, a book published in 1912, but these people had been working, this is under handout for week 3. These are the people I call, I never heard anyone else call them this, the trinominals. Ralph Barton Perry at Harvard, Edwin Bissell Holt, William Pepperell Montague, all of them trained at Harvard, Edward Gleason Spalding, Walter Taylor Marvin, and Walter Boughton Pitkin. They all used all their names. I think it was just what one did in those days. This new realism, it was important to them it was cooperative studies in philosophy. They all felt like they were pulling in the same direction. That they all saw the same sort of way forward. And one of the things that was important to them was that philosophy was to be done cooperatively. It wasn't supposed to be the lonely German genius sitting in their study. This was supposed to be a social, cooperative undertaking. And so rather than publishing sort of each of them their book, they spent 6 years collaborating. Each wrote his chapter, but thinking of it as a group effort. The second wave of that was announced in a 1920 book, though it was started in 1916. And this was Essays in Critical Realism, a cooperative study of the problem of knowledge. And the principal driving force of that was Roy Wood Sellars, though otherwise well-known philosophers like George Santayana at Harvard, Arthur Lovejoy at Hopkins, and in a second generation, Maurice Mandelbaum, who taught for 50 years at Hopkins, was at any rate a figure of 20th century philosophy, all identified as critical realists. This is the philosophical movement that Sellars cut his teeth on. His father was not only the principal figure in it. His two books, Critical Realism and Evolutionary Naturalism. The Critical Realism is the epistemological book. The Evolutionary Naturalism is the ontology or metaphysics book. But his father also lived to see this movement pass away, swept from public attention by, on the one hand, pragmatism in Dewey's hands, Dewey becoming quite prominent, and on the other hand, by the influx of logical empiricism from Germany and Austria. And late in life, said of himself and his son Wilfrid, it seems that whenever and wherever we go, it's always a Sellars against the world. That was his take on things. Now, I would be surprised if anybody else in this room had ever heard of these trinominal philosophers. This 20 years, the teens and the 20s in American philosophy, it's like a hidden valley or a lost civilization of the sort where, the plucky newspaper reporter whose father vanished there on his mission 15 years ago mounts an expedition to go there and discovers him as the king, but also the prisoner in this civilization that doesn't communicate with anything else. In the teens and the 20s, this was American philosophy. You could see John Dewey rising, and could see the influx from overseas, from England, from Germany, and so on. But this was American philosophy, and it just went away. I think this is a salutary lesson for us. They just would have been astonished, and Roy Wood Sellars was astonished that they could be so prominent, and the world spirit changed its direction, and nothing came of it. But it was very influential for Wilfrid. When he says he starts off as a rationalist realist, that realist is, well, a critical realist, and his naturalism is evolutionary naturalism of his father's sort, where what makes it evolutionary naturalism is having emergentism as a central doctrine, the way in which genuinely new things can arise out of recombinations of things that are already there. And Sellars' own rationalist take on this, he's indicating there, he's writing this in 47, that's an expression of what we saw in the autobiographical sketch when he said already in his Oxford days, he had the idea that we should understand the content of concepts in terms of their role in reasoning instead of their supposed origin and experience. That was a rationalist slogan as opposed to the empiricist one, and he's here indicating that that's the particular development of critical realism he would have. I do not recommend that you go and read the New Realists or even the critical realists. It's not deep or interesting philosophy as far as I can see. The New Realists were naive realists. What was important to them was that we perceive objects and not representations of objects. Their thought was representational realists, their phrase, who thought that our immediate contact was with representations rather than the things represented, were starting down a slippery slope that would take you to German idealism. And that was the great bad for them. Critical realism said, thinking about the problem of error and appearance tells us we don't just take in the things that are there. There's some critical conceptual activity that's going on here, and we've got to somehow make room for that. And Sellars' rationalist version of that then is saying, well, let's think about the role in reasoning of our perceptual judgments. That's going to be his aim for it. When I read Roywood Sellars, which I don't much, I've just looked at the stuff to see sort of what is there. As far as I can see, the critical realism consists of him saying, here are all the sorts of things, as I would put it, we would like to be entitled to say. We do perceive the objects as they are in the world, but there's a contribution by us too, but the contribution by us is not in the form of a veil of ideas that separates us from these. All good things you should want to say, and he says all those things. What he doesn't do is say how he can be entitled to say them all together, how it actually works. He's aspiring to this irenic, synthetic view, but what he really does is rehearse all the things that he thinks are true, rather than saying how we can actually be entitled to say them all. And similarly, on the emergent naturalism, yes, what there is what natural science tells us about, and no, it doesn't tell us about culture, but culture emerges from the natural. It's not identical with the natural, but exactly how this works, how does the emergentism go, what is the relation between those, it's extremely hazy. So this is what I mean when I say I don't see sort of deep philosophy going on there, and so I'm not rehearsing this minor episode in intellectual history as part of a campaign saying, no, these brilliant philosophers have been forgotten unjustly. Well, I don't think they should be forgotten, but I also don't see how to incorporate them into a story about sort of what we learn. Anyway, they were important to Wilfrid, they really existed, and it's worth remembering that as important as the figures in the literature today can seem, 30 years from now, maybe not. You've got to look for them actually doing some work, some force through distance, if they're going to still be interesting. The third current of thought that's running in here is really the Vienna Circle. I talked last time about neo-Kantianism in Germany, the two schools of neo-Kantians, the Marburg neo-Kantians, who focused mostly on the philosophy of natural sciences, Hermann Cohen and Paul Natorp, on the one hand, and the Freiburg, Baden, Southwest neo-Kantians, who focused on the philosophy of culture, of the social sciences. Germans think of this as a division between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften, both using Wissenschaft, science, somewhat more broadly than we would, and having this useful category of Geisteswissenschaften that includes the humanities and the social sciences. This is Wilhelm Windelband and Heinrich Richert, who were Dr. Vaters of Heidegger, of Cassirer, of Bruno Bauch, who was Frege's friend, and so on. In the next generation in Germany, there were two schools of thought, indeed called themselves schools of thought, that were in many ways the spiritual heirs of these two wings of the neo-Kantian movement. And from the Marburg neo-Kantians focusing on the natural sciences, the Vienna Circle is the heir. I'm not claiming direct historical influence, but they're the ones who took up what, at least seen retrospectively through Sellars' eyes, is a neo-Kantian point of view that he sees in Carnap, and it's an heir of that wing of the neo-Kantians. On the other side is the Frankfurt School. And really, between these poles is the early and the middle years of the 20th century in German thought. The Frankfurt School, above all, Adorno and Horkheimer, people like Walter Benjamin are associated with it. In the next generation is Habermas. They were concerned with the culture, with political theory, with the social sciences, all of this with a distinctively Marxist inflection. It's interesting that although the Frankfurt School and the Vienna Circle are in many ways polar opposites, the politics of the Vienna Circle was distinctively left-wing. Everybody was at least a socialist, and people like Neurath was a committed communist, Schlick sort of wavering between socialism and communism in this time. And it's the Vienna Circle whose influence we're looking at. I'll just mention that there's a recent English language book about the Vienna Circle called Exact Thinking in Demented Times. And it's a really readable account of them, strong on the personalities rather than on the philosophy of it, but worth reading. I'll mention one thing that was news to me. Moritz Schlick, who was Herbert Feigel's Dr. Vater, Feigl being the one who employed Sellars and was his best philosophical friend from 1936 until 1959. Indeed, Sellars is reported to have said that for many years he and Feigl were separated aspects of a single entity. That was how close he felt. Schlick, the founder of the Vienna Circle, was murdered in 1935, shot by a graduate student, died on the steps of the University of Vienna. I was there giving the Brentano lectures this last spring. If you're a philosopher, they take you to see where Schlick was shot on the steps. And the story always was that this was political. The student who shot him was in fact a Nazi, and Schlick was very vocally a socialist. And the story always was that that was why he was shot. Turns out to have nothing to do with that. This student was enamored of a female graduate student in the philosophy department who wanted nothing to do with him, and who refused to believe that she was committed to her work, was sure there had to be some man that was his rival, and she was the only woman who had been allowed to be a graduate student, a doctoral student in the philosophy department at the University of Vienna, because Moritz Schlick had read her work and found her talented, and so had prevailed on his colleagues to make a special room for her, and so the would-be suitor assumed that they were having an affair, and that so that's why he shot him dead. She left the profession, and we never found out how good she could have been over this. But they thought this was sort of disreputable, and so for years they said it was a political thing. But apparently this is not so. Okay. The intellectual influence of the Vienna Circle. There's really three phases of Carnap, anyway, that are in play here. Sellars is referring to them. There's the Aufbau period, which is radical, reductive empiricism. I think I put on the handout. If you look at the second page of it, there's Quine talking about Carnap. He says, Carnap is a towering figure. I see him as the dominant figure in philosophy from the 1930s onward, as Russell had been in the decades before. In his logical syntax, Carnap again vigorously exploited the resources of modern logic for philosophical ends. The book is a mine of proof and opinion on the philosophy of logic and the logic of philosophy. During a critical decade, the 30s, it was the main inspiration of young scientific philosophers. It was the definitive work at the center from which the wave of tracts and popularizations issued in ever-widening circles. Carnap, more than anyone else, was the embodiment of logical positivism, logical empiricism, the Vienna Circle. Quine would have counted the essays we're reading this week and next week as among the waves of tracts and popularizations in ever-widening circles, and I'm not sure that Wilfrid wouldn't have agreed with that. Second quote here is from Hempel, who, along with Feigl, they were the two youngest members of the Vienna Circle. Feigl was with them right from the beginning when Schlick started to have these weekly meetings in 1924 in Vienna. Feigl was a new doctoral student, and he started coming right then. Hempel, who was about the same age, was from Berlin. He didn't start going to the meetings until the last 18 months that they had them. Hempel spent many years teaching at Princeton, a teacher of mine, and then ended his career as a colleague here in the Pitt department. He says, in his first great work, Der logische Aufbau der Welt of 1928, Carnap developed with unprecedented rigor a version of the empiricist reducibility thesis, according to which all terms suited to describe actual or possible empirical facts are fully definable by terms referring exclusively to aspects of immediate experience, so that all empirical statements are fully translatable into statements about immediate experiences. Prompted by discussion with his associates in Vienna, Carnap soon began to develop a more liberal version of empiricism, which he elaborated while he was professor of natural philosophy at the German University in Prague, this in the early 30s. He eventually presented it in full detail in his essay Testability and Meaning, 36-37, which in the opening paragraphs of Carnap describes as a response to Lewis, C.I. Lewis. And the main innovation of that was that instead of requiring that non-observable claims that were not observation reports, be definable, have their meaning definable in terms of claims that were observation reports. He only requires that there be a weaker inferential relation between them. That at least there must be some observables that count as evidence for the theoretical claims. And I should say that in the history of the Vienna Circle, that's looking at the naturalist wing, Neurath, the empiricist wing, Schlick, and Carnap trying to have it both ways. One of the many debates was about how to think about observationality. And we will see Sellars appealing to this without telling you what's going on. He will use the notion of Protokollsatz and Konstatierung, which were two candidates, Schlick and Neurath candidates, for talking about observationality. And Carnap's own decision is to use observation sentence, beobachten Satz. What are you going to say?
Yeah, I wanted to know, so the previous view that Carnap ended up not being committed to was that an observation sentence would entail one of these non-observation sentences?
The theoretical claims had to be translatable into a set of observational claims.
So they'd be logically equivalent.
Right. And what Carnap does is start with reports of immediate experience and build up, using logical vocabulary only, build up things he claims are equivalent to theoretical claims about physical objects.
So then on his revised view where they're not so definable, does he still require that a theoretical claim will entail an observation or something?
It's the other way around. That there have to be inferential pathways from the observable to the theoretical. And he calls these reduction sentences. But where he had claimed before that there had to be biconditionals, he's only insisting now that there be conditionals that have observational antecedents and theoretical consequence. So there isn't an equivalence anymore. There's a semantic surplus on the theoretical side.
So he doesn't think that there's any, I guess, strict entailment going any direction. There's just better
Right.
or not so good inferences going from the observational to the theoretical.
Right.
Okay.
And as I say, there's a substantial literature on this development. I think the current state of play is that they think Carnap went through 5 importantly distinguishable phases, basically between 1932 and 1944. I think Rich Creeth has an article about this, but if you look up testability and meaning, that's the central pivotal move in this. And I did, by the way, put that in put a copy of that on the website just in case anybody wanted to have a look at it. Oh, and I should say, I also put, for better or for worse, the new Realist Manifesto, PDF of that, and the Critical Realist Manifesto. And if you were tempted to look at this, a late 30s statement by Roy Wood Sellars in the form of an essay, sort of what is critical realism, that would be the cheapest and easiest way into this. I did not put a copy of the Aufbau in there, but the logical syntax of language is. So if you want to look at the Carnap, it's there. Right, so Carnap argued, this is continuing Hempel, Carnap argued that the terms of empirical science are not fully definable in purely experiential terms, but can at least be partly defined by means of what he called reduction sentences, and exactly how that went, which are logically much refined versions of operational definitions, and observation sentences whose truth can be checked by direct observation. This observation sentence, Hempel is using Beobachtungen Satz, which Carnap used by contrast to either the Neurath or the Schlick versions. Carnap stressed that usually such tests cannot provide strict proof or disproof, but only more or less strong confirmation for an empirical statement. Linguistic note, Sellars is playing with this notion of confirmation with an I in introducing a new kind of rule on top of the logical syntax of language that had formation rules and transformation rules. Sellars, in this essay, introduces conformation rules. And I mean, he has a reason to call it that, but he's also playing around a little bit with this notion of confirmation. So, I think it's helpful to keep in mind all of this sort of intellectual historical background, even though I haven't said very much philosophically recently. Sellars, one of the things that makes him difficult to read is that he assumes that his audience knows everything that he knows about philosophy, has read everything he's read, and will recognize any reference that he makes, so that he can just say the syntactic phase of logical empiricism and will know, oh, you mean Carnap's logical syntax of language, not the Aufbau, not the semantic phase, which today we would identify with Meaning and Necessity, which was published in 1947, Sellars mentions in a footnote, oh, this just came out, I wasn't talking about this. But in 41 or 42, Carnap published An Introduction to Semantics, his book. That was already a full semantic turn. Carnap took it that he had learned from Tarski's theory of truth and Tarskian model theory, how an empiricist could in good conscience accept semantic vocabulary, which he had not in the logical syntax of language. Okay, so I want to say something about how Sellars wanted to turn the crank one more time on the logical empiricism that he is defecting, he says, to an enemy camp, an enemy army here in that first paragraph. In the second paragraph, he says, well, I wouldn't do it if it were just the syntactic one, but with the semantic turn, suddenly I could see prospects here. And it's a good question how Sellars, who all along aspired to give Kant his due in then contemporary philosophy, could have been enamored by the Carnap of the Aufbau. Just what did he see in this reductive empiricism of him already in that pre-syntactic phase? And here on the first page of the handout, a piece I had not read until very recently. The first volume of Carnap's collected papers has just become available. And there's this piece that he published just as he's beginning to write the Aufbau. It's a book-length piece on the formation of physical concepts. I'm just going to read this. A symbol is introduced, or if it's already in use, is subsequently legitimized by determining under what conditions it is to be employed in the representation of a state of affairs. And here he uses the Tractarian expression, Sachverhalt. They'd already read the Tractatus in the Vienna Circle in the 20s and even got Wittgenstein to go there and tell them they were idiots at one of the meetings. The introduction or legitimization of the word horse, for instance, comes about by determining the conditions which must hold if we're to call something a horse, hence through the statement of the distinguishing features of a horse or the definition of the word horse. We say of a symbol that has been introduced or legitimized in such a way that we think is at least capable of legitimization, that it designates a concept. Now, this notion of designation, that's looming large in Sellars' constructive contribution in the essay we're talking. It designates a concept. So, the symbol of a concept is a rule-governed symbol, whether it be defined or not. Its use should above all be rule-governed. The symbol should be employed not in any old arbitrary way, but rather in a determinate, consistent way. Uniformity in the mode of employment can be secured either by explicitly laying down rules or merely through constant habit, linguistic usage. And here, Gewohnheit, Sprachgebrauch, those are late Wittgenstein expressions. Carnap hasn't, Wittgenstein hadn't written that stuff yet. We have not yet said anything about what a concept is, but only about what it is for a symbol to designate a concept. And this is all that can be said with any precision. But it's also enough, for when talk of concepts is meaningful, it invariably addresses concepts designated by symbols, or concepts that can in principle be so designated. And such talk is then basically always about these symbols and the laws of their use. The formation of a concept consists in the establishment of a law concerning the use of a symbol, but as a word in the representation of a state of affairs. And I just mentioned that Sellars would later say, grasp of a concept is always mastery of the use of a word, which I think is sort of echoing this Carnapian expression.
Is this rule governing supposed to be? I mean, because it doesn't seem here like there's anything that says that, like, it sounds like proper names have the same sort of should be given the same sort of treatment. Well, a proper name, we follow certain rules for who we use it to. Is that?
I mean, we don't know whether. Anyway, I can't tell you whether Carnap here is thinking of proper names as expressing concepts or not.
Okay.
Now, he's a Frege student, so he's definitely aware of this of the Sinnbedeutung distinction. He's very much aware of the difference between predicates and individual constants, which loom large in the details of Sellars' construction in this essay. Here he's talking about horse. Well, that's a substantival, not just a predicate like red, though he obviously thinks that's true of that too, but it's a sortal expression, so it's got criteria of identity and individuation that go with it, and that's moving it toward the singular term side. I mean, that's a good question, and one would want to sort of look at this around. Because what he's doing is constructing concepts of physics, he doesn't talk about singular terms in this piece. It's like mass is what he's after. But the reason I thought it was worth reproducing this somewhat obscure passage is this is the way Carnap talked, even in the Aufbau. He talked about the rule governedness as being essential to the conceptual content of these things. And that set off all these bells in Sellars, not alarm bells, but bells of recognition. This is something I can use. This is a way forward if we're thinking in terms of the rule governedness of symbols as being what the content of concepts consists in, or anyways the form in which the content of concepts is articulated. He hears gesetzmäßig, Regel, he hears Kant in this. And so he's looking through the empiricism and seeing the neo-Kantianism here, but he's seeing that Carnap is somebody he can use to advance his thought along the Kantian dimension. Yeah.
Where's that Sellars quote from?
It's from the first volume of the collected works. I even give the page number there. As I say, until this edition just came out, I don't think this was.
No, the Sellars quote.
Oh, the Sellars quote?
The concept is always mastery.
Oh, I'm not actually sure where that is. I think we'll run across it.
Okay, yeah.
In one of our things. Okay, the last thing I want to say in a sort of historical mode and maybe transitioning to the more philosophical in the discussion of this actual essay. So last time I engaged in this suspect but I think important enterprise of trying to say what Kant's big ideas were in a short compass. And remember, the two that mattered most for Sellars are his normative conception of intentionality or discursiveness, that is the idea that what distinguishes judgments and intentional actions from the responses of merely natural creatures is that they're things that we're in a distinctive sense responsible for. That's my preferred formulation of this absolutely axial Kantian idea. And the other one is the thought that in addition to concepts whose principal expressive role it is to describe and explain empirical goings-on, there are concepts whose principal expressive role it is to make explicit, implicit features of the framework within which alone description and explanation of empirical goings-on is possible. And that's broadly the idea of the categories. And these are absolutely central to Kant, and they're absolutely central to Sellars. And there's more to the association. Anyway, just to remind you, so there I'm trying to say this for Kant. What is analytic philosophy now? And I would like to try and say in about the same very general and abstract way how I, with the wisdom of hindsight, would describe the movement that has these different strands that I was pointing to, and that Sellars saw as we approached the mid-year 1950 of the 20th century, that he saw as about to launch on a new phase, which he could be instrumental in shaping and influencing in a Kantian direction. And now this is, of course, extremely difficult and hugely controversial to what is analytic philosophy, but here's my try at it. It's looking at the relationship between a problematic vocabulary is my term, concepts, meanings, there are all kinds of alternatives that we've seen in the tradition. A problematic vocabulary, some concepts that are puzzling for some reason or from some point of view. And a base vocabulary, which is at any rate not puzzling in that regard or from that same point of view, is unproblematic from that point of view. And it is the project of elaborating the meanings expressed by the target vocabulary from the meanings expressed by the base vocabulary with the use of logical vocabulary. That's what's distinctive of analytic philosophy. And from the beginning, it's had two core programs corresponding to choices of base vocabulary anyway, and target vocabulary. And those are naturalism and empiricism. So from an empiricist point of view, your base vocabulary, the one that is not epistemologically problematic anyway in the way that the target vocabularies are going to be, is something about experience. So it could be a phenomenalist base vocabulary, or it could be a vocabulary that restricts itself to secondary quality concepts, or it could be a vocabulary that restricts itself just to observational concepts. Those are different sort of degrees of restrictiveness. And then you want to understand, well, whatever other vocabularies are potentially epistemologically puzzling to an empiricist. Modal vocabulary, normative vocabulary, semantic vocabulary, intentional vocabulary, what have you. If it's going to be empiricist respectable, what you want to do, the ideal, the program, the core program of empiricism within analytic philosophy is to explain the meanings of the problematic, expressed by the problematic vocabulary, in terms of meanings that you can express in the base vocabulary by using the tools of the modern logic, the logic of Frege and Russell in Principia. Well, and later on, maybe modal logic and other tools as well. Modalities switches sides. Well, more on the naturalist side than on the empiricist side. Quine insists no, modality is still verboten epistemologically. He famously said, modal logic is not a logic, it merely engenders the illusion of understanding, which Dana Scott then wrote an article called On Engendering an Illusion of Understanding. That's embracing this. On the naturalist side, not of epistemology, but of ontology or metaphysics, your base vocabulary for this core program of analytic philosophy is, well, take your pick, the vocabulary of fundamental physics, mathematized physics, or the vocabulary of that plus the special natural sciences, or maybe just ordinary empirical vocabulary, empirical descriptive vocabulary. Again, depending on how tight you want the pants to be that you're committed to wearing. And then again, you have vocabulary that is potentially problematic from from a naturalist ontological or metaphysical point of view. And again, those might be some of the same usual suspects. Probably not modal vocabulary, because statements of laws of nature are, loom large in all of your scientific base vocabularies. But again, semantic properties, intentional properties, normative properties, maybe the experiential properties that your friend the empiricist across the table at the Vienna Circle is insisting on. Maybe those are naturalistically, the hard problem of consciousness, maybe those are naturalistically problematic. And what you want to do is take the unproblematic vocabulary, your naturalistic vocabulary, whichever level you set it at, and explain the meanings of these potentially problematic things using logic alone to elaborate the meanings that are safe. And then you're going to say, well, that's what we're trying to do, and if you can't do it, then there's something defective about these concepts from a naturalist point of view or from an empiricist point of view. And that's the sort of invidious use of this apparatus. Now, in my Locke lectures, I tried to synthesize analytic philosophy understood this way with what I thought were the positive lessons of the pragmatist critique of it, above all by the later Wittgenstein, but by the pragmatist strain that includes even Sellars. And I was able to give the lectures again the following year in Prague with an all-star cast of commentators, Hugh Price, who I'll talk about in a minute, and John McDowell, who responded to this account, saying, yes, he endorsed this characterization of what the project of analytic philosophy was and what its core programs were. And his only question was why I thought it was a good idea to transplant perfectly healthy pragmatist organs into the walking, rotting corpse of analytic philosophy so that it could stagger through a couple more decades before going to its much-deserved demise. And I said, John, why don't you just tell us what you think about analytic philosophy? So John's view was, yes, this is on the whole a sufficiently capacious characterization of analytic philosophy and its core programs, and it is rotten to those core programs. If you understand it this way, what you should do is have nothing to do with it. And in fact, I'm neither an empiricist nor a naturalist in the sense of these core programs, and yet I think there is something crucial about it, something right about this movement of thought, something recoverable about it, and that indeed Sellars, as one of the critics, particularly of the empiricist program in this, he has his own version of the naturalist program that lets him say, oh, see, I'm still an analytic philosopher. But I think he actually points a way forward. And let me say this much about that, because we start to see it already in this essay. And let me address it, though. He's talking about epistemology here to the naturalist side. And as a clue, mention a distinction that Hugh Price, for my mind, one of the most interesting contemporary pragmatist or neo-pragmatist thinkers, makes. He distinguishes between object naturalism and subject naturalism. Object naturalism is what his Australian compatriot Frank Jackson and his student David Chalmers called the location problem. Have the world as described in your favorite level of natural scientific vocabulary, and now we have things like moral values or subjective experiences. And the object naturalist wants to know, where are they? What bit of the world as described in the naturalist vocabulary is identical with these things? And if you can't do that, if you can't locate them in the natural world, he says, well, as a naturalist, I don't accept that there are such things. Now, this is challenging for objects like numbers, say. Hartree Field wrote a book called Science Without Numbers. Being an object naturalist to the point that confronted with the ubiquity of appeals to mathematical objects in natural sciences, responded by reformulating mathematical physics in a way that doesn't appeal to mathematical objects. It's heavy second-order logic and measure theory, sort of mathematics all the way through. He was immensely gratified to find it on the carousel of books in an airport bookstore. Some book buyer had seen the title "Science Without Numbers" and thought, "Oh, well, this will be something that intelligent people, but who don't want to do the math can do." You open it up, and it says, but it at least snuck to there. But Price, who is a naturalist, says there's another way to be a naturalist. Not to be a naturalist about the objects represented by your vocabulary, but to be a naturalist about the practices of the subjects who are deploying the vocabulary. And this he identifies as the method of the later Wittgenstein, who says, look, you're mystified by the counting numbers? You want to know where 1 and 3 are in the natural universe because you assume that the right semantics for these numerals is a representational one where they designate some object and you want to know where the object is. But don't assume that you know the proper semantics for them. Look at how they're used. If it's not mysterious how we can teach kids to count, and having taught them how to count, how to add and do other arithmetic operations on them, if we can tell a perfectly reasonable naturalistic story about how they can catch on to doing that, so to use these numerals in the way that you are theoretically understanding in terms of their representing an object, maybe you should stop understanding them that way and think it's naturalism enough if you can just tell a naturalistic story about the practices of using these things. That's what Sellars' turn to pragmatics, to pure pragmatics, is doing. He wants us to focus on what we're doing in using these expressions. The sort of thing that he can see Carnap talking about here. Well, even if you don't have an explicit definition that says what the rule is, still implicit in the way you're using it, there must be a rule governing it. He's not saying that, but distinguishing between correct and incorrect uses of it in practice in the way that the kid has to learn in order to learn how to count and add and multiply and so on. But if you can tell a naturalistic story about that, then that's naturalism enough. And Rice says for many things, you're only puzzled about location problems because you're applying an inappropriate kind of semantics. You're just assuming that the semantics is a certain kind of descriptive or representational semantics. And what's impressive, I think, about Price in particular is he didn't start off as a radical anti-representationalist in semantics. He started off worrying about the difference between the formal properties of the time variable in quantum mechanics and the formal properties of the time variable in general relativity theory, and came to think, look, actually it's not mysterious how we use these things in calculation and in theorizing. We're only tying ourselves in knots when we think, yes, but which one is the real magnitude that they're both referring to? And he said, well, the location problem, as it were, for that. And it was from deep in the philosophy of physics that he came to think that the problem was with the semantic theory, not with the use of these incompatible in some sense, but not practically incompatible uses of these variables. So he worked his way out to these this general view about concept use and philosophy of language from the philosophy of physics. So what Sellars sees already in the late 40s is the prospect of a new phase of logical empiricism, of Carnap's view, that focuses on the rules and focuses on the practices of using the expressions, sees a pure pragmatics as incorporating as sub-areas the syntax and semantics that corresponded to the most recent phases in the development of actual logical empiricism. And that's what he's setting out to do in these early essays, is show how within the language of logical empiricism you can get these ideas in there at the center. You can reconceptualize what they're doing so as to take account of these crucial Kantian lessons.
Were there any really strong proponents of this first sort of naturalism, of object naturalism? Because I find it sort of puzzling that there would be.
I think it's the dominant philosophical view of our age. Who thinks that? Everybody thinks that. With a few exceptions. McDowell is a relaxed naturalist. The others are uptight naturalists, are afraid there's something spooky going to go on. It's sort of in his image. But that sort of reductive natural, I mean, I mentioned Frank Jackson as an example, but although within analytic philosophy, the empiricist program does not have many takers these days, Van Frassen and people like that, I would say Chalmers actually, but certainly people have seen that there have been devastating critiques of classical versions of empiricism from Sellars inter alia. But the naturalist side, that is, as far as I can see, alive and well, and at least in Anglophone circles, dominant.
I mean, I'm perfectly happy with naturalism in a wider sense being dominant. What I find really puzzling is what you call object naturalism. And I think that insofar it is prevalent, I can only imagine it is prevalent because people haven't thought it through.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but you know, it's a job of work, and I at least find this distinction between object naturalism and subject naturalism extremely helpful in thinking about how, you know, without countenancing spooky stuff, one can still insist that the fact that you will not find in the furniture of the natural scientist's world things like the price of Amazon stock is not a reason for us to be skeptical about the existence of things like the price right now of Amazon stock. To mention something, you know, is that philosophically puzzling? Well, anyway, you won't find it in the catalog of things that fundamental physicists talk about. It doesn't have a mass, it doesn't exert force, it's subject to none of the four fundamental forces.
So, I'm thinking through this pure pragmatism idea and subject naturalism, and I feel like I have a worry about it, but that Wittgenstein has a response to my worry, so I'm just going to try it out and see what you say. So if subject naturalism is a program of giving kind of naturalistic accounts of the rules governing certain language use or the practices that we actually engage in with certain languages, will that open up a regress of the rules by which we teach the rules of languages and the rules by which we teach the rules by which we teach the rules of
Well,
languages?
that's the topic of Sellars' Some Reflections on Language Games. That is, he's worried just about that. That after all, you have to have some concepts to understand a rule. So how did we get into the game? I mean, all of us, or each of us as young ones, or as theorists thinking about this, isn't the subject naturalist liable to be embarrassed by the object naturalist asking about these implicit norms and rules that you've got? And I mean, you can imagine the answer is, no, you've got to be a subject naturalist about those first. And if you can bring that off, then having the sort of view that even Carnap has in this quote will do it. But what is being a subject naturalist about that most fundamental normativity that was one of the Kantian insights? And Sellars sets his sights clearly on that question. I think Wittgenstein does not really. That Wittgenstein, I mean, at this level of hand-wavy, says, look, if you've learned my lesson, then you're not tempted by object naturalism. and then you're not puzzled by what the difference is between the signpost, meaning what it does, and the signpost considered just as a piece of wood, which is the description we can give in non-normative natural scientific terms of it. And if you're an object naturalist, this numinous surplus that it has, that the right way to respond to it, if you're going to Athens, is this way, not this other way. Or he talks about the dog that just sniffs the end of your finger instead of following it, or the one who follows the finger but the wrong way. And, well, what is it that makes it the right way to go on? And he's, look at how people learn to get it right. There isn't anything more than that. If we can understand the practices of learning to respond and sort of teaching the young ones, oh, it goes this way, go this way, no, you're getting that wrong. If we can understand that, that's all you have to worry about. I think Wittgenstein, it's not that there's nothing to this line of thought, is saying, if you've learned my lesson, put in these terms, then you just won't be bothered by object naturalist questions. Well, so is it wrong to think in representational terms about anything? Should we be global anti-representationalists? That's what Hugh Price thinks. I don't think that. Well, then there's a bifurcation question. Well, what ones is that a question about? Where the thing that's represented by this, if there is some, where is that and how is that related to the things we can describe in the natural vocabulary? And how do you tell the difference between the things you should understand their content in representational terms and the things you shouldn't? And can they go both ways? For instance, following Sellars, I will claim that alethic modal vocabulary is categorical vocabulary, is framework explicating vocabulary. I think it also has a descriptive use that you can only understand in terms of its fundamental expressive use. But Sellars doesn't give it a descriptive use, and I think that's a mistake. But he doesn't think anything can play both those roles, and I think we have to see that they can. Okay, why don't we take 15 minutes now, and when we come back, let's go through the essay and see what's going there. But I hope that this framework for it is useful in addressing this